The border station sat at the edge of the forest like a tooth poised on the gum line of two worlds. On one side lay the quiet, sparse countryside of my homeland, dotted with hills that rolled lazily toward the horizon. On the other was an abyss of endless trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like fingers. We called it the Shadow Grove, though the official maps marked it only as uncharted territory. It was the kind of place people avoided mentioning in casual conversation, as though naming it aloud might summon something best left undisturbed. I had been stationed at this lonely outpost for nearly a year. As a border patrol officer, my duties were, on paper, simple. I logged the movements of travelers, inspected cargo, and ensured no contraband slipped through. Yet my job was anything but ordinary. The station's rulebook, thicker than the Bible and twice as incomprehensible, contained pages of strange mandates. Some made sense in a bureaucratic way, like filing incident reports in triplicate. Others veered into the absurd. Rule 12. Never approach the forest after sundown. Rule 37. Do not respond to voices calling from beyond the treeline. Rule 51. Burn anything found on the northern side of the border unless instructed otherwise. I followed the rules out of a mixture of fear and pragmatism. Every officer who worked this post left with the same advice. Obey the rules. Don't ask why. Tonight, the station was colder than usual. I sat at the main desk, the lone bulb above me swaying slightly from a draft I couldn't locate. My logbook lay open, its pages half filled with the mundane. A farmer crossing back with a cart of potatoes. A lone hiker claiming he got lost, though his boots were strangely clean for someone who'd been trekking through mud. The boredom of my shift was broken by the arrival of a package. I heard it before I saw it. A hollow thunk at the door, like something heavy dropping onto the porch. I grabbed my flashlight, its beams slicing through the station's dim interior, and approached cautiously. The package was rectangular, wrapped in brown paper, tied neatly with twine. No postage, no address, just a single note tucked beneath the string. To the keeper, do not open until the 7th night. The handwriting was angular and sharp, as though written by someone in a hurry, or perhaps in fear. I picked up the package. It was heavier than it looked, and a faint metallic smell clung to it. My gut told me to toss it into the incinerator, but something stayed my hand. Instead, I placed it on the desk and tried to shake the unease that crept along my spine. The forest outside seemed closer that night, its shadowed expanse pressing against the station's walls. I glanced at the clock, 11:13 p.m., and cursed the slow crawl of time. Shifts here dragged endlessly, each hour more oppressive than the last. It wasn't just the solitude. There was something else. I'd never seen anything in the woods. Not really, but I felt it. There was always a sensation of being watched, as though unseen eyes studied my every movement. Some nights, I'd catch the faintest flicker of motion between the trees, only to find nothing when I looked closer. The air inside the station felt heavier as the clock ticked on. I poured myself a cup of coffee, its bitter heat burning my tongue, and tried to focus on the logbook. Yet my eyes kept straying to the package. It sat there, silent and foreboding, as though daring me to open it. I shook my head and stood, deciding to stretch my legs. The station's main room was small, with a desk, a wood stove, and a radio that barely worked on good days. A narrow hallway led to the sleeping quarters, which were little more than a cot and a blanket. The third room housed the incinerator, a black, cast-iron beast that devoured anything thrown into its maw. Beyond the station was the porch, and beyond that, the treeline. Even now, with the station's lights glowing faintly in the windows, the forest loomed like an ink blot against the night. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my boots, and inhaled the cold air. The sound hit me then, a faint whisper, almost too soft to hear. "Help, please." I froze. The voice was distant but distinct, carried on the wind like a stray thread. It was faint, almost fragile, as though whoever called out was on the verge of collapse. My mind raced. Every instinct screamed at me to go back inside, to slam the door and pretend I hadn't heard it. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the forest. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only the first few rows of trees. I saw nothing, yet the voice continued, a soft, desperate plea. Please. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Rule 37. Do not respond to voices calling from beyond the treeline. The memory of the rule stopped me in my tracks. My grip on the flashlight tightened, my breath visible in the cold air. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, the only sound my pounding heartbeat. Then the voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. The station felt even colder now, the light overhead flickering as though struggling to stay alive. I sat back at the desk, the package still waiting in its spot like an uninvited guest. My hands trembled as I poured another cup of coffee, though the liquid offered no comfort. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though sleep eluded me. When my shift ended at dawn, I found myself lingering, reluctant to leave. Something had shifted during the night, a thread pulled loose from the fabric of my routine. Before I left, I glanced at the package one last time. The note's message repeated in my mind like a mantra: do not open until the 7th night. I locked the station behind me and walked to my car, the frost crunching underfoot. As I drove away, the forest shadow seemed to follow me, stretching long and thin across the road. When I returned that evening for my next shift, the package was still there, untouched but somehow heavier with meaning. The unease that had settled over the station the night before lingered, thick as fog. The rules existed for a reason. I didn't need to understand them to know that. But as I sat there, staring at the package, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens if I break them? The first thing you learned at the border station wasn't how to patrol or check documents. It wasn't even how to handle a firearm or operate the incinerator. It was the rules. The rules were the heartbeat of the post, its pulse thrumming quietly beneath every task and decision. Some of the rules were standard, the kind of protocols you'd expect in any government job. But others, well, those were the ones they didn't put in the official training manual. You only learned them through whispered warnings and the tired, haunted eyes of the officers who'd been here too long. I still remembered my first day at the station, a raw recruit fresh out of training. Officer Greger, my supervisor at the time, had handed me a battered notebook scrawled with the unofficial rules. These aren't suggestions, he'd said, his voice flat. Obey them. No questions. At first, I thought it was some kind of hazing ritual, a prank played on the new guy. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized the rules weren't a joke. They were survival. Rule 12. Never approach the forest after sundown. I'd broken that rule last night, though only by a single step. The thought gnawed at me as I sat at the desk, staring out at the treeline. There was something about the forest that didn't sit right, even in daylight. The way the shadows seemed darker than they should be. The way the trees never swayed no matter how strong the wind blew. It was as though the forest existed in its own little bubble, cut off from the natural world. You feel it, don't you? Greger had asked me once. The way it watches? I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Now I did. Rule 37. Do not respond to voices calling from beyond the treeline. That rule felt personal now. I hadn't broken it, but I'd come dangerously close. The memory of that voice, the soft, desperate plea for help, still lingered in my mind. It had sounded so real, so human, and yet, there was something wrong about it. A faint undercurrent that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but wonder, who or what had been calling out to me? By midday, I'd settled into the routine of my shift, though the tension never fully left. The package sat untouched on the desk, its presence a constant reminder of my unease. I busied myself with paperwork, logging the few travelers who passed through the border. Around 3 p.m., an older man arrived at the station. His face was lined with wrinkles, his shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. He wore a patched coat and carried a small canvas bag. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly. "Here to see the archives." The archives were a room in the station's basement, filled with dusty ledgers and records dating back decades. They weren't open to the public, but exceptions were sometimes made for researchers or historians. "You got permission?" I asked. The man nodded, sliding a folded letter across the desk. It was stamped with the ministry's seal, granting him access to historical records pertaining to the Northern Border Agreement. I felt a flicker of curiosity. The Northern Border Agreement was a topic we didn't talk about, not officially at least. The few scraps of information I'd managed to piece together hinted at some kind of treaty between our government and something else. "Follow me," I said, leading him to the archives. The room smelled of mildew and old paper, the air thick with dust motes that danced in the weak light of a single bulb. The man set to work immediately, flipping through ledgers with a practiced efficiency. "What are you looking for?" I asked, unable to resist my curiosity. He glanced up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Answers," he said simply. I didn't press him further, but his words stuck with me. Answers. That was the thing about this place. Everyone who came here was looking for something, though they rarely found it. By the time the man left, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. I walked him to the door, watching as he disappeared down the road toward the village. As night fell, the station grew quiet again, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. I tried to focus on my duties, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man's visit. What answers had he been looking for? And had he found them? Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. "Station 12, this is Central. Come in, over." I grabbed the receiver, grateful for the break in the monotony. "This is Station 12. Go ahead, over. We received a report of unusual activity near your location. Any disturbances to report? Over." I hesitated. The voice in the forest came to mind, but I dismissed it. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Central. Over." A pause. Then, "Understood. Keep your eyes open. Central out." The radio fell silent, leaving me with more questions than answers. What kind of unusual activity were they talking about? The night dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of a faint tapping at the window. My heart lurched as I sat up, my eyes darting toward the glass. The station's lights reflected off the window, obscuring whatever was outside. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. The tapping stopped. I scanned the area, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I poured another cup of coffee, the liquid sloshing over the rim. The package sat on the desk, silent and unassuming. I stared at it, the words on the note echoing in my mind. "Do not open until the 7th night." As dawn broke, I found myself once again lingering at the station. The rules had always been my anchor, the one thing that kept the strangeness of this place at bay. But now they felt like a cage, binding me to rituals I didn't understand. I thought about the old man's words. Answers. Maybe it was time I started looking for some of my own. The night the rules broke, it wasn't a scream that pulled me out of my uneasy sleep, but silence. It wasn't the normal kind of silence that filled the station, the kind I'd grown used to. This silence was a void, pressing into my ears until it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. I sat up on the narrow cot, the blanket tangled around my legs. My heart thudded against my ribs as I strained to hear something, anything, that would explain the oppressive stillness. Even the wind outside had stopped. The station's interior glowed faintly in the light of the desk lamp I'd left on, its bulb humming softly. My eyes flicked to the package, still sitting exactly where I'd left it. Then I heard it. It wasn't a scream, not at first. It was a whimper, low and desperate, the sound of someone barely clinging to hope. "Help me," the voice said. I froze. The voice was a woman's this time, soft and pleading. Came from outside, from the direction of the forest. "Please, I'm hurt, someone." Rule 37. Do not respond to voices calling from beyond the treeline. The memory of the rule hit me like a slap, my body instinctively recoiling. But the voice continued, rising in urgency. "Help! Please!" I stood, my legs stiff with tension, and grabbed the flashlight. My fingers fumbled with the switch, the beam trembling as I aimed it toward the window. I couldn't see anything past the glare of the glass, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me!" I clenched my jaw, trying to ignore the primal instinct to go to her. The rules existed for a reason. I knew that. I'd seen the fear in Gregor's eyes when he warned me never to break them. But fear wasn't the only thing gnawing at me now. What if it was real? What if someone was out there, hurt and alone? The voice cracked, a sob bleeding into the words. "Please, I don't want to die out here." I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting against my skin. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows deepened by the pale light of the crescent moon. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating only the first few feet of ground. "Hello," I called, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. "Who's there?" No response. I took a few cautious steps toward the tree-line, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The beam of my flashlight wavered, the surrounding trees seeming to shift and bend as I moved. "Can you hear me?" I called again. This time, the voice returned, closer. "Yes, here, please." It was coming from just beyond the tree-line, where the underbrush grew thick and tangled. My pulse quickened as I crossed the invisible boundary that separated the station's yard from the forest. I didn't notice the shift at first. It was subtle, like the air itself had grown heavier. The sounds of the world, my breathing, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, seemed muffled, as though the forest was swallowing them whole. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Here," the voice whispered, so close it could have been breathing against my neck. I whipped around, the flashlight darting wildly. The beam caught nothing but trees, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the shadows. And then I saw it. It was just a glimpse, a pale figure darting between the trees, its movements unnaturally fast. My breath hitched as I swung the flashlight toward it, the light catching a flash of something white. "Wait!" I shouted, breaking into a run. The figure didn't stop. It moved deeper into the forest, its silhouette barely visible through the thickening shadows. I pushed forward, branches clawing at my coat and face as I followed. "Stop!" I called, my voice echoing in the silence. The figure disappeared. I stumbled to a halt, my chest heaving. The forest was silent again, the air so still it felt suffocating. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. That was when I realized how far I'd gone. The station was nowhere in sight, its warm glow swallowed by the trees. Panic gripped me as I spun in place, trying to orient myself. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. The forest didn't answer. I don't know how long I wandered, my flashlight growing dimmer with each passing minute. The shadows around me seemed to shift and stretch, forming shapes that dissolved the moment I looked directly at them. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate steps that mirrored my own. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. By the time I stumbled back into the station's clearing, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. My legs felt like lead, every step a struggle as I approached the porch. I stopped short when I saw the door. Deep scratches marred the wood, long gouges that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to burst open. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. The package was still on the desk, its note fluttering slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I locked the door behind me and collapsed into the chair, my hands trembling as I poured a cup of coffee. The liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling on the desk. I hadn't broken the rule entirely. I hadn't helped the voice, hadn't crossed fully into the forest. But I'd come close, too close. As I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something new. The package was heavier. I lifted it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of something that hadn't been there before. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost overpowering. I stared at the note, Do not open until the 7th night. My mind screamed at me to rip it open, to see what was inside. But I couldn't. Instead, I set it down and waited for the sun to rise fully, the light washing away the shadows. But even then, the unease didn't fade. I had broken the rules, and something had followed me back. The morning light spilling through the station's windows did little to chase away the weight pressing on my chest. Every sound, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the faint hum of the desk lamp, seemed sharper, as if the air itself was listening. I hadn't slept. My mind replayed the night's events in relentless loops. The voice in the woods, the pale figure darting between the trees, the scratches on the door, and the package. It sat on the desk where I'd left it, heavy and silent, a reminder of the rules I'd bent and the consequences I was now waiting for. I stared at the note again, my pulse quickening with each read. Do not open until the 7th night. But it was only the 3rd. The first sign that something was wrong came that afternoon. I was outside, inspecting the station's perimeter, when I noticed the tree-line. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what was different. The trees looked the same as always, tall, gnarled, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. But as I stepped closer, a chill crept down my spine. The forest was closer, not by much, but enough to make me stop in my tracks. I'd walked this path 100 times, knew every rock and root along the border. The forest's edge had always been a clear 10 feet from the station's fence line. Now it was 8. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. I even paced the distance, counting each step. But the numbers didn't lie. The forest was moving. The second sign came later that evening. I was sitting at the desk, staring blankly at the logbook, when I heard the sound. It started as a faint tapping, like fingernails drumming on glass. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The sound came again, more insistent. It was coming from the window. Slowly, I turned my head. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the station's interior, the desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. My nerves were shot, and my imagination was running wild. But then the tapping came again. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the door. My breath caught as I stared at the heavy wooden door, its scratches from the previous night still fresh. The tapping was soft but deliberate, a rhythmic knock that sent a chill through my body. I stood slowly, my hand moving toward the flashlight on the desk. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it. For several long seconds, I stood there, staring at the door. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the silence. Then, as I took a cautious step forward, I heard it. A voice. "Let me in," it said, muffled by the door but unmistakably clear. My stomach dropped. It was the same voice from the night before, the soft, desperate plea of a woman on the verge of tears. "Please," she whispered. "It's cold out here." I backed away, my pulse hammering against my ribs. My mind raced with memories of the rules, of the warnings Gregor had drilled into me. Rule 37. Do not respond to voices calling from beyond the tree-line. But this voice wasn't coming from the tree-line. It was coming from the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I sat in the chair, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Please, I'm hurt. Let me in." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But no matter how hard I tried, the voice seeped through, a relentless whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. By the time it stopped, the sun was rising. The third sign came the following night. I had just finished my rounds when I noticed something new on the desk. At first, I thought it was another report, misplaced in my exhaustion. But as I picked it up, I realized it wasn't paperwork. It was a photograph. The edges were frayed, the surface smudged with fingerprints, as though it had been handled many times. The image showed a man in a border patrol uniform standing in front of the station. He was younger than me, his face set in a grim expression. I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were the words, "I broke the rules. My blood ran cold as I stared at the photo, the man's face hauntingly familiar. I'd seen him before in the station's archives, his name listed among the officers who had worked this post decades ago. He had vanished. That night, the dreams began. I was back in the forest, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with fog, muffling my footsteps as I wandered deeper into the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of laughter. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each step I took. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was cruel, mocking, the sound of something that knew I was lost. I turned, trying to find my way back, but the trees seemed to shift around me, their branches weaving together to block my path. Then I saw the figure. It was standing just ahead, half hidden by the mist. Its form was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was wrong. It had no eyes. The laughter grew louder as the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as though I just sprinted a mile. The package was still on the desk, its presence heavier than ever. The note glared at me in the dim light. Do not open until the 7th night. By the 5th day, the signs were impossible to ignore. The forest had crept closer, its shadows spilling into the clearing like ink on paper. The tapping at the window returned each night, joined by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And the package was growing louder. At first, it was faint, a soft hum that I could almost convince myself was my imagination. But as the days passed, the sound grew stronger, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I wanted to throw it into the incinerator, to rid myself of its weight and its secrets. But the rules stopped me. Do not open until the 7th night. Whatever was inside, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. Not yet. The 6th night began with rain. It came down in sheets, hammering against the station's roof and windows, turning the clearing outside into a quagmire of mud. The sound was deafening, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out even my thoughts. I stared at the package on the desk, my eyes tracing the twine wrapped tightly around the brown paper. The hum coming from it had grown louder, an almost rhythmic thrum that seemed to pulse in time with the rain. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was inside, it wasn't waiting for the 7th night. It wanted to be opened. The sense of unease that had been building over the past week was suffocating now. The forest was closer than ever, its edges nearly brushing against the station's fence. I could see the dark shapes of the trees swaying slightly, though the air outside was still. The tapping had started again, softer this time, as though whatever was outside was growing impatient. My hands trembled as I reached for the photograph I'd found the night before. The man's face stared back at me, his grim expression now etched into my mind. I broke the rules. I had to know what had happened to him. The archives were in the basement, a small, windowless room filled with dusty shelves and filing cabinets. I rarely went down there. The damp smell of mildew and the dim lighting made it feel more like a tomb than a record room. I flipped through the station's logs, searching for the man in the photograph. His name was Officer Dmitry Sokolov, and he'd been stationed here nearly 30 years ago. His records were sparse, but one report caught my attention. Incident Report March 7th. Filed by Officer Dmitry Sokolov. Unexplained activity reported at the northern border. Observed movement in the forest after sundown. Heard voices calling for help. Investigated against protocol. The report ended abruptly, the remaining pages missing. I dug deeper, combing through old correspondence and memos. What I found painted a picture far more disturbing than I'd imagined. There were mentions of the Northern Border Agreement, a treaty signed long before my time. The documents didn't specify who or what the agreement was with, only that the rules were part of the deal. One memo, dated decades earlier, chilled me to the bone. The rules exist to maintain the balance. Non-compliance will result in breach. Those who defy the terms will be claimed. Claimed. The word lingered in my mind, heavy with implication. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of an old ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. It listed the names of every officer who had worked this post. Many names were crossed out with a single word beside them. Vanished. Sokolov's name was among them. The rain continued to pound as I climbed back up to the main room. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. The package sat on the desk, humming faintly. I sat down and stared at it. The words on the note etched into my mind. Do not open until the 7th night. I should have burned it, thrown it into the incinerator and walked away. But I couldn't. Whatever was happening to me, to the station, to the forest itself, was tied to that package. I needed answers. I waited until midnight, the hour when the world seemed to pause, caught between one day and the next. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a new sound. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. My hands shook as I reached for the package, my fingers clumsily untying the twine. The paper fell away, revealing a small wooden box, its surface etched with intricate carvings. They were symbols I didn't recognize, their shapes twisting and curling like tendrils. The hum grew louder as I opened the lid. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. The pages were filled with frantic, uneven handwriting. The words scrawled so tightly they overlapped in places. I flipped to the first page, my pulse quickening as I read the opening lines. To whoever finds this, I am sorry. I broke the rules, and now it's coming for me. The journal belonged to Sokolov. His entries described the same experiences I'd been having, the voices, the tapping, the sense of being watched. He'd broken the rules just as I had, and the consequences had been swift. The forest moves closer each night. The air grows heavier, the shadows deeper. I hear them in the walls, in my dreams. They are patient, but they will not wait forever. As I read on, the entries became more erratic, the handwriting devolving into near illegibility. I thought I could stop it. I was wrong. The rules aren't there to protect the border. They're there to protect us. The final entry was short, the words smeared as though written in a hurry. It's inside. God help me. It's inside. A loud crash jolted me from my reading. The sound came from the hallway, where the incinerator was housed. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the noise, my every instinct screaming at me to stay put. The hallway was dark, the bulb overhead flickering weakly. The door to the incinerator room was ajar, swinging slightly in the draft. Pushed it open. The room was empty, save for the black, hulking shape of the incinerator. Its metal surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, the hatch slightly open. My stomach churned as I stepped closer. The air was heavy with the smell of ash and something else, something metallic and sweet. I peered inside. The ashes weren't cold. Something moved behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. For a split second, I saw it. A pale figure standing at the end of the hallway, its form distorted and wrong. Its eyes, or the places where its eyes should have been, stared back at me. The light flickered, and the figure was gone. I stumbled back into the main room, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled with the journal, flipping through the pages as though searching for answers that weren't there. Sokolov's words echoed in my mind. It's inside. The package sat on the desk, its hum now a low, steady pulse. I didn't know if I could survive until the 7th night. The 7th night began with silence. Not the oppressive, heavy quiet that had haunted me before, but something worse. It was the absence of sound, as though the world itself had been muted. No rain, no wind, no creak of the station's old wood. Even my own breathing seemed swallowed by the stillness. The forest loomed closer than ever, its shadows pressing against the windows. The trees now stood just beyond the fence line, their gnarled branches stretching toward the station like eager hands. The package sat on the desk, its hum rising and falling like a heartbeat. I stared at it, the weight of the past week pressing down on me. Whatever was coming, it would come tonight. I spent the hours leading up to midnight preparing, though for what, I couldn't say. My flashlight's batteries were fresh, my sidearm loaded and checked. I'd barricaded the doors and windows as best I could, dragging furniture against them in a futile attempt to feel safer. But deep down, I knew none of it would matter. I'd broken the rules. I'd invited the forest's curse into my life. Now it was coming to collect. At 11:55 p.m., the hum from the package grew louder, filling the room with its low, resonant thrum. The desk beneath it vibrated faintly, the sound burrowing into my skull. I reached for the package with trembling hands. The note was still there, its words etched into my memory. Do not open until the 7th night. I untied the twine, my heart pounding as I lifted the lid of the wooden box. Inside was a small, circular mirror. The frame was made of tarnished silver, engraved with symbols that matched those on the box. The glass itself was dark, almost black, and seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. As I stared into the mirror, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. At exactly midnight, the tapping began. It was louder this time, more insistent, as though something was pounding on the windows with fists instead of fingers. I gripped the mirror tightly, the cool metal biting into my palms. My flashlight lay on the desk, forgotten. The pounding grew louder, echoing through the station. Then the voice came. "Let me in," it said, soft and lilting. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. It wasn't the voice of the woman from before. This voice was deeper, its tone rich and honeyed, like a predator imitating human speech. "Keeper," it said, "you've waited so long." The barricades rattled, the furniture scraping against the floor. "Let me in, and it will all be over." I backed away from the door, clutching the mirror like a shield. The pounding stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the walls. The mirror's surface began to ripple, the darkness within swirling like ink dropped into water. Shapes formed in its depths. Trees, shadowed figures, and something else. A face. It was pale and featureless, its empty sockets staring back at me. The shape shifted, stretching and twisting until it filled the glass entirely. "You've seen me," the voice whispered, now coming from the mirror itself. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The face held me in its gaze, pulling me deeper into the glass. "Keeper," it said again, the word dripping with malice. "Do you understand now?" The shadows in the room grew thicker, pressing against me like living things. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and the sound of laughter, cruel and mocking, filled my ears. I stumbled backward, the mirror slipping from my hands. It hit the floor with a dull thud but didn't break. The room around me was changing. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the wood darkening as though soaked with water. The windows shattered one by one, letting in a cold, unnatural wind that carried whispers I couldn't understand. The forest was no longer outside. It was here. The figure appeared in the doorway, its form taller than I remembered. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body draped in shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. The featureless face tilted toward me, as though studying me. "You broke the rules," it said, the voice reverberating through the station. I scrambled for my sidearm, my fingers fumbling with the holster. I raised it and fired, the deafening crack of the gunshot splitting the air. The bullet passed through the figure, hitting the wall behind it. The creature didn't flinch. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows around it seemed to reach out, stretching toward me. "You belong to us now," it said. In my panic, my hand found the mirror on the floor. Without thinking, I raised it toward the creature. The moment the glass faced it, the creature froze. The shadows around it recoiled, writhing like snakes in pain. The figure let out a guttural roar, its body convulsing as the mirror's surface began to glow. I held the mirror steady, the light growing brighter until it filled the room. The creature staggered backward, its form dissolving into the shadows. With one final, ear-piercing scream, it disappeared. The room fell silent. I stood there, shaking, the mirror still clutched in my hands. The station was in ruins, the windows shattered, the walls warped and splintered. But the forest was gone. The trees had retreated, their shadows no longer pressing against the station. I dropped the mirror onto the desk, its surface now dull and lifeless. The weight of the past week crashed down on me, and I sank into the chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages fluttering in the faint breeze. I flipped to the final entry, reading Sokolov's words one last time. The rules aren't there to protect the border. They're there to protect us. I understood now. The station wasn't a line dividing two nations. It was a boundary between worlds, and I was its keeper. The station felt different now. The air was still heavy, the shadows longer than they should have been, but the oppressive presence of the forest was gone. For the first time in a week, I could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside. The faint chirp of crickets carried with it. The package sat empty on the desk, the mirror inside lifeless and dull, its power spent. The journal lay beside it, its scrawled warnings etched into my mind. I had survived the 7th night, but survival came with a cost. I had become part of the station's story, another name added to the long list of keepers who had stood on this line between worlds. The rules, once a mysterious set of commands I resented, now carried a weight I could never explain to anyone else. 2 weeks passed. The days blurred together as I repaired the station, boarding up the broken windows and reinforcing the walls. Each creak of wood or shift in shadow sent a jolt of fear through me, though nothing strange happened. Not yet. The forest had retreated to its original place, the treeline once again a clear 10 feet from the fence. But I knew it was only a matter of time. The forest didn't forgive, and it didn't forget. I had upheld the rules even when I'd broken them. The balance had been restored, but the station still felt like a trap, an inescapable loop for those who dared defy the order of things. The knock at the door came on a rainy evening. It was soft, hesitant, yet still managed to make my stomach lurch. For a brief, horrible moment, I thought it might be them again, the shadows returning to claim what they hadn't taken the first time. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the warped glass window. It wasn't a shadow. It was a young recruit, his uniform still crisp, his face pale and nervous. A wide-eyed rookie, just as I'd been when I first arrived. "Station 12, he asked when I opened the door, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm here for the handover." Handover. The word struck me like a thunderclap. I had forgotten about the rotation, about the next officer scheduled to take my place. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The recruit followed me inside, his boots squelching slightly on the damp floorboards. He glanced around, his brow furrowing as he took in the boarded windows and the faint smell of ash that lingered in the air. "Quiet place," he said, trying to make conversation. I didn't reply. Instead, I handed him the battered notebook, the one Gregor had given me when I first arrived. The unofficial rules. "Read this," I said, "and follow it. No questions, no exceptions." He blinked, flipping through the pages. "What's all this? Some kind of hazing?" "It's not a joke," I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Do what it says. It'll keep you alive." He looked at me, his expression uncertain. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt I'd had. He thought it was a game, a relic of old superstitions passed down from officer to officer. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain what I'd seen, what I'd done. But the words caught in my throat. Even if I told him, he wouldn't believe me. Not until it was too late. I gathered my things that evening, stuffing my belongings into a single duffel bag. The station felt even heavier as I prepared to leave, the weight of its secrets pressing down on me. Before I left, I hesitated at the desk, my hand brushing against the journal. It felt wrong to take it as though it belonged to the station itself. Instead, I placed it in the drawer alongside the mirror. I turned to the recruit, who was busy setting up his cot in the back room. "One last thing," I said. He looked up. "Don't open any packages you don't understand," I said. "And if you hear something outside, ignore it, no matter what." He frowned, confused, but nodded. "Got it." As I stepped out into the cold night air, the forest loomed behind me, quiet and still. I could feel its presence, like an old predator watching from the shadows. The road stretched out ahead, winding toward the village. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of relief. The station was behind me. The rules were behind me. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that the station wasn't done with me yet. The recruit's voice called out from inside, breaking the stillness. "Hey, there's something at the door." I stopped, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned back to the station, its dim light glowing faintly through the boarded windows. "Don't answer it," I shouted, my voice sharp and urgent. The door creaked open behind me, and the sound of distant laughter echoed through the trees.